Hey there, welcome to the channel. I'm Ben, and today I'm going to tell you guys why I think the mighty, somewhat archaic DR650 is still going to be a vastly superior dual sport adventure bike in comparison to the brand new 2025 Suzuki DRZ4S. So to start off, if any of you guys haven't seen the videos that I put out on the DRZ4S already, I am a previous DRZ400 owner. I had an 08 about 10 years ago as my very first dual sport, and now I just recently acquired a 2018 Suzuki DR650 that I actually traded a Gen 3 KLR for. And like I said in some of those other videos, I was really pretty well set on picking up the new DRZ4S. I thought it would be great to compare not only to the original DRZ400, but also my DR650. However, my very first reason to go to a DR650 instead of the new 4S is the price, and that's why I've decided not to pick up at least a brand new DRZ4S. It may very well be worth what Suzuki is asking for it, but with the new 4S model coming in at $8,999 in comparison to the $7,199 that actually both the DRZ400 and the DR650 will cost you, man, either one of these bikes is going to require some amount of mods, some in slightly different places than others, which we will get into in this video. But man, unless you're planning on buying it and just riding it as is, I mean, if you're going to stick any money into mods, the DR650, especially for adventure type riding, just seems like, well, the sort of the obvious choice. And of course, everybody's needs are a little bit different when it comes to, well, just about every aspect of motorcycle riding. I personally have about an hour trip on the pavement, either county roads or the freeway, to get to my off-road trails. And when I get off-road, I want to be able to ride anything from sort of fun ATV trails with jumps on it to some kind of nasty single track and maybe even a little bit of muddy two track. So I personally need something that's going to be able to get me up to those trails, let me ride around for as long as I want, and then get me back home, hopefully without having to fill up or bring extra fuel along. And because I'm somebody that's forced to spend a substantial amount of time out on the pavement, I want something that is good wind protection and that is also fun to ride. But a lot of you guys that are planning on taking sort of longer trips, possibly across the country, definitely are, well, going to have a few different needs, and that's why I think this next category is really, at least for the first couple years anyways, definitely going to make the DR650 a vastly superior option, and that's the aftermarket support, options, and used part availability. After nearly 25 years, the old DRZ400 has a ridiculous amount of aftermarket parts available, and there's lots and lots of bikes out there, so it's pretty easy to find and purchase used parts if you're on a trip somewhere. And as nice as it would be to be able to just transfer parts from an old DRZ to a new DRZ4S, it doesn't really seem like a lot of them are going to fit. I'm sure some of the somewhat universal parts will, but to me, looking at the sort of differences between the two, it doesn't seem like there's going to be a whole lot that would transfer. So if you're going to buy a new 4S, you're probably going to be waiting a while for just about anything. Whereas the DR650 has been around for 35 years, so there are tons and tons of DRs out there. I think it's one of the best-selling bikes that Suzuki has probably ever made, and of course there's maybe not as much in the way of different options for aftermarket bolt-on parts, but there are definitely some very important ones, especially for adventure-type riding. And this next thing sort of almost is going to tie into the next category. It's kind of somewhere in between this one and the next. That's the fact that the new 4S model actually has a reduced fuel capacity in comparison to the DRZ400. The new one only has a 2.3 gallon tank, where the DR650 actually comes stock with a 3.4 gallon tank. And like I said, that sort of ties in nicely to this next category or reason, and that is the ADV road abilities of each of these bikes. For those of you who are lucky enough to live close to your trails and maybe just need to run a bit of pavement to sort of link trails up, the DRZ400 and the DRZ4S gearing is probably just fine. With only a 5-speed transmission though, I know a lot of previous DRZ400 owners and new prospective buyers of the 4S were really wishing that it was going to come with a 6-speed transmission. And to be honest, I think that the 5-speed gear set that they have, even the sort of close ratio set, probably makes a lot of sense for what Suzuki is really intending this bike to be and what they've sort of always intended it to be. And of course, we all want to modify bikes and like different bikes for different reasons. So I think it makes a lot of sense that aftermarket companies have come out with the sort of wide range 5-speed gear sets. But while it's great to have that option, it's definitely kind of a big deal to do. You have to take the engine out of the bike, split the case apart. It's certainly not something that I would be too excited about doing. Rather than widening that case out for a 6th gear, I really think they should have stuck in something similar similar to the Aftermarket wide range gear sets. And the reason that I'm so confident in that is the fact that my DR650 seems to have a wider range 5-speed gear set that really works very, very well out on the pavement. I've never had any problem getting up to highway speeds, holding highway speeds, or even passing cars on the freeway. And honestly, a lot of that testing has been done after I put a 14-tooth sprocket on it in comparison to the 15-tooth, which in comparison to the 15-tooth brings the power down a little bit even. So that's vastly different than bikes like the KLR650 or the DRZ400. And I would of course assume the new DRZ4S, unless they did change the ratios and I'm just unaware of that. As far as I know, they're the same, but if any of you guys know any different, definitely let us know. And now, of course, dual sport adventure riding is not all about highway or even road at all. We definitely still need a bike to perform decently off-road, and I certainly want to be able to get down on just about any trail that I find, and that's certainly where the DRZ4S is going to shine in comparison. It has a suspension, travel, and ground clearance of, well, almost 1.5 inches more than the DR650, so it's certainly going to be vastly superior on single track or any really nasty woods trails, maybe even some motocross track, where the DR650 with its slightly lower ground clearance and slightly less suspension travel is going to suffer on those nastier trails. But to be honest, riding both the old DRZ400 and now the DR650, I can tell you, in my personal opinion anyways, the DR650, other than its mushy suspension, which we'll get into in a bit, handles vastly better on just about every other terrain. It's more stable on the highway, it's more fun in the twisties, it's a lot easier and more fun to handle on my sort of fast-moving ATV trails, and while the mushy suspension doesn't really soak up the jumps as much, I'm much more willing and able to sort of fishtail around the corners, and I don't know, the DR650, it feels so nice on just everything other than those really, really nasty trails, and that's why I think if you're somebody that's looking to do dual sport adventure riding, it's just a much better option. And when it comes to moto camping, while both the DRZ4S and the DR650 have around the same horsepower, the DR650 with its bigger displacement has a decent amount more torque. So when you're going to load the bike down and possibly still try to run on the freeway, I would definitely love to hear from you DRZ400 owners that load your bikes down with camping gear, but I would have to assume that the DR650 is going to be much better and much happier loaded down with gear in comparison to the sort of higher strung woods bike that the DRZ400 and DRZ4S seem to be. Now, this next part, again, is not going to be really important to any of you guys that don't do a lot of pavement pounding, but for somebody like me anyways, I really like the fact that actually the DR650, the DRZ400, and I would assume the DRZ4S someday have the ability to bolt on a rally tower, windscreen, whatever you want to call it, right onto the steering neck, where bikes like my XR650 don't have anything there to attach to. And of course, I totally understand that a lot of you guys that don't spend a lot of time on the road certainly don't want anything blocking your view of what's right in front of your tire on the trail. Somebody like me that is, again, going to spend a decent amount of time on the pavement and wants to be able to enjoy it certainly benefits from something like a windshield or a rally tower. It protects me from the wind and sort of lessens the fatigue so I can ride longer and be comfortable for longer, but it also keeps the elements off both the rain and the cold and possibly even the snow in some cases. It also provides me with my personal favorite place to mount a GPS, which is basically right sort of below my line of sight, so if I'm stopped somewhere, I can just look a hair down at whatever it is that I need to see and then kind of keep my peripheral on any of the traffic that might be around me. I don't have to look down on my lap to see anything and then all of a sudden there's a car coming. So for my personal needs anyways, it's just where I prefer to have my navigation unit. And if I'm being honest, I really just like the rally look. I think it really makes these bikes look cool. And sort of along those same comfort lines, I think both the DRZ400, 4S, and DR650 for adventure type riding really are going to require a more comfortable seat, like a seat concept seat. However, I think personally anyways, while I have changed some ergonomics with some bar risers and some different bars, I think the DRZ400 definitely felt a little bit more like a off-road woods motocross-ish bike, where the DR650 is maybe not an adventure bike ergonomically, but feels a little bit closer in that direction anyways. If any of you guys have ridden both of them, let me know if you agree or disagree. And this next one I think is going to surprise a lot of you guys, but hear me out to the end here. I think the DR650, at least for the adventure type riding that I plan on doing with my bike is actually going to be a much better bike off-road, again, for my type of riding, and I'll tell you why. To start with, yes, the new 4S model does have upgraded KYB suspension, and really even the old DRZ400 had a much better suspension setup than the very soft DR650 suspension, but with the price difference and the fact that, from what I can tell anyways, you can put a pretty decent set of upgrades in the suspension department on a DR650 for, well, somewhere around $600, fluids included, and skip the headaches and maintenance that comes along with the upside down forks on the 4S model. Even though you do have to put a little bit of work into it, again, if there's other aspects of this, including the price, that are making you wonder which direction to go, I mean, with a little bit of work, I think the suspension on a DR650 could definitely be right about where it needs to be. And beyond that, while the new DRZ4S is only going to weigh 330 pounds, a lot like the old DRZ, it seems like it's going to carry its weight a little bit higher, and with the 36.2 inch seat height, it's also going to carry your weight much higher, whereas the Mighty DR carries its 366 pounds much lower to the ground and has a much lower seat height, which I've noticed just in comparison to my XR650, which now even lowered an inch and having somewhere around about 12 inches of ground clearance and a 35 inch-ish seat height, feels, well, not near as fun to ride off or on road, really, because of that high center of gravity. And I'm sure there are a lot of you that could ride circles around me on a DRZ4S, a DRZ400, or even the XR. It still is just, I don't know, a lot more fun to me to ride a bike like the DR650 that just always feels very solid and planted, as long as there aren't any bumps for the soft suspension to throw me off, I suppose. And additionally, for those of us who have a shorter inseam height, I'm about 5'10", and I've got a 31-inch inseam, and I weigh about 150 pounds. The DR suspension at its sort of highest setting has a seat height of 34.8 inches, and it's actually factory adjustable, so you could swap a few things around, and some of that is internal to the forks and a bit of work, but it gives the ability to drop the seat height to just 33.2 inches, which is definitely a very beginner-friendly or vertically challenged rider-friendly number. And not only is that good for newer riders, it's also good for those of us who want to load our bikes down but not have to worry about dropping them because we can't quite get our feet to the ground. Now, this next category is kind of a big deal to some and maybe not such a big deal to others, and that's the fact that the DRZ4S really isn't a simple bike anymore, and the DRZ400, I suppose being liquid cooled, you could say is a little bit more complex. There's also a few other things that I like a bit more about the DR650 that we'll get into, but now the DRZ4S is going to have EFI, it's going to have ride modes, ABS, and of course the old DR650 has none of that. It's got a carburetor, an analog gauge, but it actually does still have two keyed accessory wires that you can tap into if you want to put some tech on your bike. There's one up underneath the headlight cowl and one underneath the seat that I've actually personally tapped into for some of my accessories. Oil changes on both bikes seem fairly similar and not too much of a hassle either way. However, I think it's important to point out that the DR650 does hold a little bit more oil, so you've got a little bit more volume and cleaning capacity there, which is kind of a nice thing for adventure riding. And also on the maintenance side of things, the new 4S and the old DRZ400 had a relatively complicated and complex process that went along with both checking and adjusting the valve clearances, and that's because the DRZ400 and 4S have a shim under bucket valve design, whereas the DR650, you don't have to pull the valve cover off or anything. You don't even have to buy any shims, and you certainly don't have to unbolt and possibly screw up putting your camshafts back in. I don't know how many busted off bolts and stripped threads I've seen. It's not something that I would personally want to have to do. And that's why I really like the quick access and quick adjustments for the valve clearances on the DR650. You essentially just unbolt a little cap, and then you can stick your feeler gauge right inside of there without removing anything other than the cap. And to make any changes, you just loosen up a locking nut, make your adjustment, lock everything back down, put it together, and go. Doesn't get much better than that. And sort of along those same lines, the DR650 is definitely going to be a much better bike for those of you who enjoy wrenching and modifying bikes. You don't need a computer to adjust any of your fuel or air stuff. It's definitely something that I think a lot of people really like. I definitely understand that, but I also really have come to like electronic fuel injection, and honestly, as long as ABS works well like it does on my 701, I would really rather have it there as a safety net. You never know what's going to happen out on the road, even if you've gotten yourself out of bad situations before. I think the safety net of ABS, while it's not something that we should rely on, I think it maybe is a good thing that bikes are starting to have this. But again, for those of you that plan on being out on your bike for weeks or months at a time, simply being able to change out a jet or adjust something on the carburetor or just get into the carburetor if something's going wrong is going to be a much better option than possibly having to find a dealer when you're out in the middle of nowhere. And generally, even a full jet kit is going to be a lot less expensive than a ECU reflash, if that's even going to be possible in the future. I know there's been sort of some crackdowns on that sort of thing, so you might not even be able to do that in the future. So we started out with cost, and we're actually going to end with cost as well. First, we're looking at just the MSRP, which is of course important, but I think a lot of us in the back of our minds look at that MSRP and are also factoring in all of the other aftermarket stuff that we know that we're going to need to bolt onto the bike. So I put together a sort of build list for both the 4S and the DR650. That would be sort of my plan. So I'll just run through everything here and we'll see what we end up with for totals. So for the 4S, again, we're looking at $8,999 plus somewhere around $1,000, we'll say, for a DIY gear change for that sort of wide ratio 5-speed gear set. Next, we've got a rally tower for somewhere around $1,000. You can pick up the ARX kits for a little bit cheaper, but with some more high-end upgrades on them, they get a little bit closer to that $1,000 mark. And to be clear, neither of those, as far as I'm aware anyways, are available yet. The next thing is an aftermarket fuel tank at, I'm going to say, $259. Again, there's nothing available yet, so we don't really know the cost, and we also don't know how much capacity we could really be even looking at. If it's anything like the old DRZ400, then you might only end up with just a little bit more capacity than a stock DR650 tank. This next one, again, is not available yet and is sort of an estimate as far as cost goes. I've got $360, which I believe I actually used from a DRZ400 full seat concept seat. You might be able to get the cover and the foam and transplant that onto your old pan for a bit cheaper, but it's definitely nice to just have a drop-on seat and then you could sell or keep your old one. So without any taxes, fees, or any of the other sort of common universal mods like skid plates and handguards and that sort of stuff, we're looking at $11,618, which is definitely a very expensive dual sport adventure bike. Probably a really pretty awesome dual sport adventure bike, definitely a nice light bike, and if you lowered it just a little bit, I think the handling would probably improve a bit, and that definitely could be a nice machine. I certainly would like to build one if I could ever get my hands on a used one of these. But before we get too excited, let's take a look at the DR650 build and see what that'll cost. So the bike itself is going to be $7,199. We'll say $10 for a 14-tooth sprocket that will again sort of bring the power down low. That just makes it, well, a little bit more fun both on and off road, and again really has had no negative effects that I've noticed on the highway other than maybe decreasing fuel mileage all around, I suppose. And of course that's certainly going to be much easier to install than a wide ratio gear set on a DRZ. Then we've got $1,000 for essentially the same rally tower, $600 for that suspension upgrade front and rear, which of course I haven't personally tested, but from what I've heard from a lot of you guys, definitely makes the DR an entirely different bike, both on and off road, and I'm really pretty excited to do that to mine this season. Then we've got the already available 6.6 gallon tank that puts the capacity and range past that of the KLR 650, which is a pretty amazing and impressive feat, especially since the DR would still be quite a bit lighter than especially the Gen 3 KLR. I've got $380 for, again, a full seat concepts replacement seat, $86 for a 1 1/8 rocks offset conversion riser, and $48 for a chub bar, which is exactly what I've got done to my DR650, and I feel like that's definitely something that I would want to do and would certainly suggest if you're somebody that likes your bars a little bit higher and a little bit farther forward. And again, I've got videos on all this stuff. I'll actually put a DR650 mod playlist down in the description, or build playlist, I suppose it is. I'm also sort of including that to sort of keep up with the DRZ4S, which now does have higher bars and a 1 1/8 chub bar, which in my experience just sort of makes the bars, well, a little bit stronger, but they also seem to pick up a little bit less vibration, which is certainly going to be nice for those long hours of adventure riding. So with all of that, including the 6.6 gallon tank for huge range, a heavier spring in the back, heavier springs up front, along with emulators, we are still only just about $600 over the MSRP of the DRZ4S. The build total for the DR650 is $9,582. Now, of course, I know a $10,000, even modded $10,000 35-year-old design certainly isn't what I think a lot of people think of when they think of the perfect dual sport adventure bike. But to be honest, I really think there is something special about these big bore thumpers, which is why I rode 2 KLRs, why I went to the XR and the DR650. They're just really, really good bikes for sort of bridging that gap between highway comfortability and ability and gear carrying ability, and also being able to tackle some pretty intense trails. And again, I'm sure still not as good on those hairier trails as the DRZ4S is going to be. But again, if you're somebody that's looking to do more than just ride trails and do a little bit of pavement, man, I think the DR650 is definitely the way to go. If you guys have any differing thoughts or opinions, or if you agree with me, definitely let me know. I'm really excited to complete my DR650 build and see if I'm right about this, because of course a lot of it is speculation, but just looking at everything on paper, the time that I've had on the DRZ400 and the time that I've had on my DR650, while each bike of course is going to have its positives and negatives about it, again, for my type of riding, the DR650, I think, definitely is the one to get. And of course, going right back up to the top of the list at that price, it seems like the much more sensible option, especially if you're somebody that is going to want to put on a skid plate with, say, a glide plate like I stuck on my DR650 that sort of allows you to slide over things a little bit easier. I would always recommend a set of hand guards, something that actually wraps around and attaches to kind of the center part of the bars and the outside. That's going to protect your hands from the wind, the rain, and also from a crash. And that's not only going to protect your hands crashing into something possibly, but also if you tip the bike over, then you don't have to worry about bending your levers up as much, as long as they're placed correctly. Rocky Mountain and Tusk, of course, is a sponsor of the channel, but I really like the D-Flex handguards. They're really not all that expensive, and the ADV version definitely fits all of the bikes pretty well that I've tried to stick them on, especially with the aftermarket chub bars that I've really personally come to like. Personally, I would also add probably a CarPlay unit like the CarPry W702 and W702 Pro that I've got on my XR and the DR650. They provide you with a lot of different navigation options, any app that you can use on your phone and that has a CarPlay ability on some sort of CarPlay unit. You can transfer and use right on that screen in front of you, which is certainly nice. I definitely like having the nice large screen as well. I've also really been enjoying both the seat heater and the grip heaters that I put on the XR, and I will eventually be putting that on the DR. That'll actually be one of the next parts of the build for that bike. I also still need to stick my luggage racks on both the XR and the DR, and I will then be running a rackless bag system made by Tusk. It's the Highland X2 rackless system. I've used that on my 701 Enduro in previous years when we went on camping trips, and it works phenomenally. I like that everything stays kind of nice and close to the bike, and you also don't have to bolt a bunch of heavy pannier racks on. And for me personally, I think that is going to end up being the perfect dual sport adventure bike, and a bit of a unicorn among a lot of the other new, kind of more expensive, fancier bikes that have been coming out in the last couple of years. So if you guys agree or disagree, definitely let me know down in the comments if you love your DRZ400 or your DR650, or if you're just trying to decide between these two or maybe something else. Thanks for watching, guys. Take care, stay safe, stay swanky, get out there and enjoy this beautiful world God created any chance you get. And if you can't do that right now, here's more videos to check out in the meantime. I'll catch you guys in the next one.